The teamster set his coffee down on Pike's counter and laughed hard enough that the men at the stove turned to listen. "The Ossen widow," he said, "has moved her children into the old water barrel. I watched her pack mud under the belly of it like she was caulking a ship." He shook his head. "3 young ones, living in a tub. Someone said the children would freeze to the iron hoops by morning. Someone else said it was not a matter of freezing, it was a matter of time before the town intervened." Outside, past the pump house, the widow knelt in the frozen mud beside the curved cedar wall and pressed another handful of clay into the gap between wood and earth. She did not look toward the store. Her hands were cracked and bleeding. She pressed harder. Ragna Assen had not slept in 2 days. The last time she closed her eyes, her husband Torsten was alive, coupling freight cars at the Wicklow tank siding in a freezing drizzle that turned the iron couplers slick as grease. By the time the yardman's whistle blew, Torsten's hand was caught between 2 drawbars, and by the time the section crew pried the cars apart, he was bleeding from the chest where the coupling pin had driven through his coat, his ribs, and his left lung. He died on a plank table in the pump house while a brakeman held a lantern, and Ragna held his hand, and their youngest daughter, Marte, screamed from the arms of a woman whose name Ragna never learned. That was December 23rd, 1887. 3 days later, on the morning after Christmas, the railway section boss nailed the bunkhouse door shut. His name was Amos Brackett. He was 58 years old, built like a fence post that had weathered 30 winters and refused to fall. He had managed crews, repaired washouts, and buried 4 men along the Northern Pacific line between Tower City and Valley City, and he did not enjoy what he was doing now. But the company voucher Torsten Ossen had earned covered 6 weeks of bunkhouse rent. The store debt swallowed the rest. There was nothing left, and the railway did not house widows. Ragna stood in the sleet with her 3 children and watched Brackett drive the last nail. Eli, her eldest, was 10. She held Marte against her hip and did not blink. Kittel, 7, pressed his face into Ragna's skirt and coughed, a wet tearing sound that had started 2 days ago and had not stopped. Marte was 4. She had stopped crying sometime in the night, and now stared at the hammer with an expression that belonged on a much older face. Everything Ragna owned was piled on a canvas tarp beside the rail, 1 cracked cookpot with a loose handle, 2 wool blankets that smelled of coal smoke and her husband's sweat, a sewing kit wrapped in oilcloth, 12 matches in a tin, a hand axe with a loose head that Torsten had always meant to fix, 8 pounds of flour in a sack already damp from the sleet, 1 pound of salt pork going gray at the edges, and $3.40 in coin. The coin sat in a drawstring pouch that had held Torsten's tobacco. She could smell him every time she opened it. Brackett stepped back from the door and looked at her. He was not a cruel man. He had given her an extra day past the voucher's end and taken the store debt off the final accounting so she could keep the coins. But he had a section to run, and the company had rules, and the rules said families without a working man did not stay in railway housing. "You have people east?" he asked. "No." "West?" "No." "Money for a ticket?" Ragna looked at the $3.40 worth of tobacco pouch and said nothing. Brackett pulled his collar up. The sleet was thickening. He looked at Eli, at Kittel's cough, at Marte's blank stare, and something moved behind his eyes that he did not let reach his mouth. "There's a family in Valley City that takes boarders, 12 miles east. If you start now, you can make it before dark." 12 miles in sleet, with a 4-year-old, a coughing 7-year-old, and 8 pounds of flour. Ragna had walked the Dakota Prairie in winter before. She knew what 12 miles meant when the ground was ice and the wind came from the northwest like a hand pressing you into the earth. She knew that Kittel's cough would turn to something worse if he spent 6 hours wet. She knew that Marte could not walk 12 miles, and that carrying her meant leaving the flour or the blankets, and without both, they would arrive in Valley City with nothing to offer a boarding family except 4 mouths and no money. She could not go east. She could not go west. She could not stay in the bunkhouse. The general store would not extend further credit to a dead man's wife. The nearest homestead claim office was in Jamestown, and even if she could file on a quarter section, which, As a widow, the law allowed Esser, she had no lumber, no stove, no plow team, no seed, no draft animal, and no time. Winter was not coming. Winter had arrived. The temperature at dawn that morning was 9 degrees above zero, and it was still falling. Brackett looked at her one more time. Then he said the thing that would follow Ragna for the rest of her life. He said it without malice, without pleasure, and without any doubt that he was right. You need 4 walls, a roof, 6 cords of wood, and a stove that draws. You have a trunk, 3 children, and a dead man's receipt. He paused. I am sorry about Torsten, but sorry does not build a house. He walked back toward the depot. The sleet hissed against the rail. Eli looked up at her mother and asked the question that was also the answer, though neither of them knew it yet. Where do we go? Ragna picked up the hand axe and the flour sack. She left the cookpot for now. She took Marte from Eli's arms and balanced the child on her hip, feeling the small body shiver against her ribs. She said, We walk the siding. We find what is here. What was here was not much. Wicklow Tank was barely a town. It was a water stop, a place where the Northern Pacific steam engines drank from a wooden tower beside the tracks before grinding west toward the Missouri and beyond. There was a depot, a pump house, a coal shed, a store run by a man named Lucius Pike, a scattering of shanties and sod houses belonging to section workers and their families, and the skeleton of a community that had been promised a branch line and not yet received one. The branch line would bring settlers, grain elevators, a school, a church. Without it, Wicklow Tank was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better. Ragna walked south along the siding with her children, past the pump house where Torsten had died, past the coal shed with its lock and chain, past Pike's store where a man in a fur cap watched her through the window and did not come out. The sleet turned to snow. Fine, dry snow that did not melt on her coat but collected in the creases like white sand. Kittle coughed and coughed again. Eli carried both blankets rolled under her arm and did not complain. 300 yards past the store, the siding curved south toward a shallow draw where runoff collected in spring. The pump line ran from here to the water tower, or where the water tower had been. A November gale had sheared the tower's upper frame and dropped the tank 20 feet to the frozen ground. The tank lay on its side beyond the pump shed like a dead animal, half buried in drifted snow, its cedar staves dark with age and water stain, its iron hoops black against the white prairie. It was 24 feet across and 15 feet long. A railway water tank of the standard type, a ram, cylindrical, built from western red cedar staves 2¼ inches thick, bound by 9 iron hoops, with a capacity of roughly 25,000 gallons when intact. It was not intact. The bottom head had split on impact, leaving one end open like a mouth. The upper hoops were bent. 2 staves near the break had cracked lengthwise, but the body of the tank, the long curved barrel of it, was whole. The cedar was sound. The remaining hoops held. Ragna did not see it yet, not fully. She saw a broken thing lying in the snow, and she walked past it the way you walk past wreckage when you're looking for something that might save you. But Eli saw the chicken. One of Pike's hens had escaped its coop, a common event in a town where the coops were made of scrap lumber and the wind found every gap. The hen had run under the curved belly of the fallen tank, where the snow did not reach and the ground was bare frozen dirt. Eli dropped the blankets and crawled after it. Ragna heard her daughter's voice echo inside the tank. A strange sound, hollow, close, amplified. She crouched at the open end and looked in. The interior was dark, but not black. Light filtered through the vent hole at the far curve, and the cedar walls had a warmth to them, not temperature, but color, a reddish brown that absorbed the gray light and gave back something softer. She could smell the wood. Clean, sharp, dry. Like her father's workshop in Telemark, where he built barrels and casks and vats for the dairy and the brewery and anyone who needed something that could hold liquid without leaking. Eli caught the chicken. She held it against her chest and said, "It is quiet in here." It was quiet. The wind that had been pushing snow sideways across the prairie did not reach the interior of the tank. Ragna could hear it, a low moan across the upper curve, but inside, the air was still. She placed her palm against the cedar wall. The wood was cold, but not the biting cold of iron or stone. Cedar held its temperature differently. She knew this from telemark. Her father had told her. He had pressed his thumb against a barrel seam and said, "Feel that. Iron steals your heat. Wood keeps its own counsel." She pulled her hand back and looked at the space, 15 feet deep. 24 feet at the widest point of the curve, but usable width, the area where a person could sit upright, was perhaps 15 feet across at shoulder height. The floor was the curved inner surface of the tank, which meant it was not flat. Everything would roll toward the lowest point of the curve. The walls arched overhead, meeting at the top where the vent hole let in a disk of gray sky. It was not a house. It was not even a room. It was a barrel lying on its side with one end broken open, but it was out of the wind. Ragna counted what she knew. The cedar staves were 2¼ inches thick. Cedar resisted rot better than pine or fir. Cedar held warmth better than any softwood she knew. Her father had said so, and her father had built vessels that held boiling water without sweating on the outside. The tank's curved shape meant wind could not hit a flat surface and push through. It would slide over the curve the way water slides over a stone in a stream. There were no corners where snow could pack and pry boards apart. There were no joints where two walls met and left a gap for drafts. She thought about Brackett's words. 4 walls, a roof, 6 cords, and a stove that draws. She did not have any of those things. But Brackett was thinking about a house. He was thinking about flat walls that the wind hit square and pushed through, about corners that leaked, about a box that needed constant fire to replace the heat it constantly lost. What if the problem was not the cold? What if the problem was the shape? She did not say this aloud. She did not yet trust the thought, but she crawled into the tank and sat against the far curve, where the intact bottom head closed the cylinder, and she pulled Marte onto her lap and felt the wind stop. Kittle crawled in after her, then Eli still holding the chicken. They sat in the dark curve of the cedar tank, and for the first time in 3 days, the air around them was not moving. The chicken settled in Eli's lap and closed its eyes. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived the way heat arrives in a cold room, slowly, from the edges inward, building as each small observation connected to the next. Ragna sent Eli back for the cookpot, the sewing kit, and the matches. She struck a match and lit a candle stub she found in the sewing kit's oilcloth wrapping. The flame burned straight up. No flutter, no sideways lean. She moved the candle toward a seam between 2 staves and watched. The flame did not move. She moved it to another seam. Still. She moved it to the cracked stave near the open end, and the flame bent hard and nearly died. So the body of the tank was tight. The open end and the cracked staves were the leaks. Everything else was sealed, the iron hoops pressing the staves together the way her father's hoops had pressed his barrel staves, each one depending on the next, the pressure making the whole thing stronger than any single piece. She draped her shawl over the cracked stave and watched the candle flame steady again. Her father's voice came back to her, clear as the day he had said it. She was 12 years old, standing in his workshop in Telemark while he tapped the side of a coopered vat. "Air leaks are where winter enters," he had said. "Find the leak, and you have found the enemy. Everything else is just patience." She had not thought about that lesson in 20 years. She had not needed it. In Norway, they had a house. On the ship to America, they had a berth. In the railway bunkhouse, they had walls that someone else maintained. But now there were no walls, and the lesson returned like a hand reaching across an ocean and 2 decades to grip her shoulder. She could not build a house, but she might be able to seal a barrel. Not the whole barrel. The tank was 24 feet across and 15 feet long. Heating that volume with a candle and body warmth was impossible. But she did not need the whole tank. She needed a room, a small room, a room the size of the warm corner in her father's workshop, where he slept beside the stove on nights when the weather was too bad to walk home. 8 feet. She needed 8 feet of the closed end, partitioned from the rest, sealed against drafts, banked with whatever she could find to stop the cold from creeping through the cedar. 8 feet deep, 15 feet wide at shoulder height, tapering to the curve above and below. Enough for 4 people to sleep on a raised shelf where the warmer air would collect. Enough for a lamp in a sand-filled box. Enough for breath, if she cut a vent at the high point and let the stale air out while cold air crept in low. She knew the principle. Her father had explained it while showing her how brewery vats needed air holes to let the fermentation gases escape without letting outside air rush in. High vent for the bad air that rises. Low intake for the fresh air that sinks. The vat breathes without losing its warmth. A voice came from outside the tank. "You planning to raise that chicken in there, or are you just hiding?" Beret Flatten stood at the open end, her arms crossed, her face red with cold. Beret was 31, Norwegian-born like Ragna, widowed 2 years earlier when her husband's horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and threw him onto a fence post. She had a soddy a quarter-mile south with 2 sons, a milk cow, and a stubbornness that the community had stopped trying to soften. She had brought a jar of broth and a piece of flatbread wrapped in cloth. "I'm not hiding," Ragna said. "I'm thinking." Beret ducked inside and looked around. She touched the cedar wall the way you touch something you do not trust. "Thinking about what? Living in a water tub?" "Living in part of one," Ragna explained. "The partition, the mud banking, the raised shelf, the vent." As she spoke, she watched Beret's face move through surprise, consideration, and doubt, settling on the expression of a woman who has heard a plan that sounds almost reasonable and therefore suspects a fatal flaw she has not yet identified. "The floor's round," Beret said. "Your bedding will roll to the center every night. Your children will wake in a pile. That is why I need the shelf, raised, flat boards across the curve, braced on the hoops." "You have flat boards?" "The tower braces. Brackett left them stacked by the pump house. They are broken, but they are flat." Beret sat down on the curve of the tank floor and slid 3 inches toward the center. She looked at Ragna. "A barrel keeps water in," Beret said. "It was never meant to keep a family alive." "My father kept beer alive in barrels for 6 months at a time. Beer does not like cold any more than children do." Beret handed her the broth and the flatbread. She did not argue further, but she did not agree. She stood, looked at the cedar walls one more time, and said, "What happens when the first gale pushes snow through that open mouth?" Ragna did not have an answer yet, but she had a candle that burned straight, a wall that stopped the wind, and a memory of her father's hands on iron hoops. She had 8 pounds of flour and $3.40 and 3 children who needed to not die. She started pulling loose debris from the tank floor. The mockery started before the mud was dry. Lucius Pike heard about it first, the way Pike heard about everything in Wicklow Tank, through the thin walls of his store, where men gathered around the stove to warm their hands and share the small cruelties that passed for conversation in a place where nothing else happened. "The Ossen widow has moved her brood into the old water barrel," said a teamster named Harlan, laughing into his coffee. "Saw her packing mud under the belly like she was caulking a boat." Pike did not laugh. Pike calculated. He was 46, lean, sharp-featured, with the particular alertness of a man who understood that every object had a price and every person had a debt. He ran the only store between Tower City and the next siding west, brokered freight for settlers who could not afford their own wagons, and extended credit with the patient certainty of a man who knew that winter made everyone desperate and spring made everyone pay. Half the families at Wicklow Tank owed him something. The ones who did not owe him bought from him anyway, because there was nowhere else. Pike held Ragna's account. Torsten had bought on credit through the fall flour, salt, lamp oil, nails for a shelf he was building in the bunkhouse, a wool cap for Kittle. The debt was not large, $11.60. But Pike did not think in terms of debt owed. He thought in terms of leverage held. The water tank was a different kind of calculation. When the tower fell in November, the railway had written it off. The tank, the tower timbers, the iron braces, all of it was salvage. Pike had been waiting for the ground to thaw enough to drag the tank to his yard, strip the cedar staves for lumber, pull the iron hoops for scrap, and sell the tower braces as fence posts. The salvage was worth perhaps $40 to the right buyer, maybe $50 if he broke it down himself and sold the pieces separately. Now a widow with 3 children was living in his inventory. He came on the second morning with 2 hired men. One was a thick-armed Norwegian named Decker, who unloaded freight wagons. The other was a young man named Nate Rusk, who did whatever Pike told him to do and did not ask why. Ragna was on her knees outside the tank, mixing clay from the draw with ash from the depot's waste pile and handfuls of dry prairie grass she had pulled from under the snow. Her hands were red and cracking. Mud was caked to her elbows. The mixture steamed faintly in the cold air, and she was pressing it into the gap between the tank's lower curve and the frozen ground, filling the space where wind could creep underneath and steal heat from the floor. Pike stopped 10 feet away and looked at her, the way a man looks at a horse that has wandered into his barn without permission. "That tank belongs to the Northern Pacific Railroad Company," he said, "and the Northern Pacific has an arrangement with me regarding salvage on this siding." Ragna did not stop pressing mud. "The Northern Pacific also owed my husband 4 months of death benefit. They paid for 6 weeks of bunkhouse rent and called it settled. That is between you and the railway." "Then the tank is between me and the railway, not between me and you." Pike's jaw tightened. He looked at Decker, then at Rusk, then back at Ragna. "I have a letter going east on tomorrow's freight asking for written salvage permission. When that paper comes back, this tank and everything attached to it belongs to me. You can pack your mud somewhere else." Ragna stood up. She was not tall, 5'4", narrow-shouldered, with hands that were strong from sewing and scrubbing, but not from fighting. She looked at Pike and said, "My husband died coupling your freight cars. The company paid nothing. If you want to strip the roof off a dead man's children, you can explain that to the next section boss who comes through." Pike did not answer. He turned to walk back toward the store. Then he stopped because Amos Brackett was standing by the pump house, watching. "That tank was written off after the tower fell," Brackett said. His voice was flat, the way it always was when he was stating a fact he did not intend to debate. "The repair orders said replace, not salvage. No engine will drink from it again." "Written off is not the same as given away," Pike said. "No," Brackett said, "but given away is what happens when a thing sits in the snow for 2 months and nobody claims it. You did not claim it, Pike." "She did." Pike looked at Brackett for a long moment. Then he said, "We will see what the letter says," and walked back to his store with Decker and Rusk behind him. Ragna went back to pressing mud. She did not thank Brackett. Brackett did not expect thanks. He watched her work for another minute, his breath steaming, his hands in his coat pockets. Then he said, "That mud will freeze tonight and crack off by morning." "I know," Ragna said. "I will put more on tomorrow." "You will run out of ash before you run out of gaps." "Then I will burn something and make more ash." Brackett almost smiled. He did not, because Amos Brackett had not smiled since a train wreck near Mandan in 1883, but the muscles around his mouth moved in a way that suggested the machinery still existed. He went back to the depot. Ragna worked until dark. She mixed 4 batches of mud and packed the entire south-facing curve of the tank base, filling the gap between wood and ground to a depth of 6 inches. The mud froze overnight, as Brackett predicted. Half of it cracked and fell away, but half of it held. The half she had packed tightest, pressing it with her fists until her knuckles bled, forcing it into every pore and cranny of the frozen earth. She learned something that first night. The mud that held was the mud she had mixed with more grass and pressed harder. The mud that fell was the mud she had spread thin and hoped would stick. The tank was not going to reward hope. It was going to reward pressure. The same principle that held the staves together, compression, each piece forcing the next into place, held the mud against the curve. She would need more grass, more ash, more clay, more time. She had none of these things in sufficient quantity, but she had a candle that burned straight inside the tank, and she had children who slept that first night without the wind reaching them, and she had a question that nobody in Wicklow Tank could answer except her. Could you seal a barrel big enough to live in before the prairie sealed you in the ground? The next morning, Ragna sent Eli to the pump house to ask Brackett for the broken tower braces. Eli came back carrying 2 8-foot planks and dragging a third. She also carried a cracked thermometer that Brackett had taken from the pump house wall. He had attached a note to it with wire. The note said, "So you can read your mistake before it kills you." Ragna hung the thermometer on a nail inside the tank. It read 21 degrees. Outside, the air was 6 above zero. 21 was not warm. 21 was not safe. 21 was the temperature at which water in a cup would stay liquid if you kept it close to your body, but a child's fingers would still go numb in an hour. 21 was 15 degrees better than outside, and 15 degrees was the difference between dying in the night and waking up stiff but alive. It was something. It was not enough. She needed to seal the open end. She needed to build the partition. She needed the raised shelf. She needed a lamp that would burn without filling the space with smoke. She needed a vent that let bad air out without letting all the warmth follow. She needed someone who knew how to work with hoops and staves and curved wood in ways her father had shown her from a distance, but never taught her hands to do. She did not know it yet, but that person was 3 days away, riding a freight wagon from the east with a tool bag and a cough that would eventually kill him. For now, Ragna had mud, ash, grass, 3 planks, a cracked thermometer, and the kind of stubbornness that looked like madness from the outside and felt like mathematics from within. She mixed the 5th batch and pressed it harder. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could only see the outside of what you were building? The tower braces were rough-sawn pine, 8 feet long, 4 inches wide, splintered at the ends where they had snapped during the tower's collapse. They were not good lumber. A carpenter would have used them for kindling, but they were flat, and flat was what Ragna needed for the sleeping shelf. She dragged all 3 inside the tank and laid them across the curve at shoulder height, resting each end on the interior surface of a hoop. The hoops were iron, 1.5 inches wide, bolted through the staves at intervals. They were strong enough to hold the weight of 25,000 gallons of water pressing outward. 3 children and a woman pressing downward would not trouble them, but the braces were too short. At shoulder height, the interior width of the tank was roughly 15 feet. 3 8-foot braces placed side by side covered the width, but left a gap between each one wide enough for a child to roll through. She needed cross pieces. She needed something to close the gaps and create a solid platform. She did not have cross pieces. She had a hand axe with a loose head and a sewing kit. On the morning of December 28th, she took the hand axe to Pike's store and asked to buy a wedge and 3 feet of rope. Pike looked at the axe, looked at her, and named a price of $1.20. The rope alone was worth perhaps 15 cents. The wedge was scrap iron. Ragna knew it. Pike knew she knew it. But Pike also knew she had $3.40 and no other source of supply. She bought the wedge and the rope for $1.20 and walked out with $2.20 remaining. Enough for 4 pounds of flour at Pike's prices, or 6 pounds if she walked to Valley City, which she could not. Every purchase was a subtraction from a number that was already too small. Every nail, every yard of canvas, every ounce of lamp oil moved her closer to zero, and zero meant her children starved before the cold killed them. She wedged the axe head tight and split one of the braces lengthwise, then split the halves into rough planks 2 inches wide. She laid these across the 3 main braces as slats, spacing them a finger's width apart, and lashed them with the rope and strips of canvas torn from the wagon cover she had found frozen to a fence post behind the pump house. The shelf held her weight. It held Eli's weight. It held both of them together. It would not hold if someone jumped on it, but no one was going to jump. They were going to lie still and breathe and try to keep warm, and the shelf would hold that. Below the shelf, on the curved floor of the tank, Ragna spread the 2 wool blankets over a layer of dry grass. This was the cold zone. Above the shelf, where warm air collected against the curved ceiling, was where the children would sleep. The partition, when she built it, would hang from the top of the curve to the floor, 8 feet back from the closed end, creating the warm chamber. She did not have the partition yet. She had the wagon cover canvas, but It was torn and frozen and not wide enough to span the full curve. She needed more material. She needed needle and thread and time, and the sky outside was the color of iron and getting darker. Kittle's cough had not improved. If anything, it was deeper, wetter, with a rattle at the bottom that made Ragna's hand stop moving every time she heard it. She brewed willow bark tea from a branch she cut beside the draw and made him drink it. He said it tasted like dirt. She said dirt was what kept trees alive, and trees were what kept people alive, and he should drink it and stop complaining. He drank it. The cough did not stop. By the end of December 28th, Ragna had accomplished the following. The sleeping shelf was built and lashed. The south-facing mud bank was repacked and holding. The wagon cover canvas was thawing inside the tank, and the thermometer read 23 degrees at shelf height. 23, 2 degrees better than yesterday. Not enough. Not nearly enough. A child could survive at 23 degrees under blankets, but a child could not thrive, could not heal, could not stop coughing. She needed 40 degrees to stop Kittle's decline. She needed 50 to call it safe. She needed the partition, the vent, the lamp, and the mud bank completed around the entire base before the temperature outside dropped further. She had 6 days before the new year. She did not know that she had 17 days before the worst blizzard in Dakota Territory's history. If she had known, she might have worked faster, or she might have picked up her children and started walking east and died on the road like so many others would. There is no way to know. What she did was sleep on the shelf with her children pressed against her body and wake before dawn and start mixing mud. The temperature outside on December 29th was 2 degrees above zero. Ragna had 12 matches left. She had used one to light the candle. She could not afford to use another until she had a lamp and a system for keeping it lit. Fire was currency now, the same as money and flour and time, and she was running out of all three. She pressed mud into the north-facing curve and listened to the wind moan over the top of the tank and thought about her father's hands on the iron hoops of a barrel in Telemark, 20 years and an ocean ago, and she pressed harder. Moses Kettler arrived at Wicklow Tank on the last day of 1887, sitting on the back of a freight wagon with his tool bag between his knees and a wool scarf wrapped around a cough that had been with him since November. He was 62 years old, black, Canadian-born, in a settlement near Chatham, Ontario, where his parents had come through the underground network a decade before the war. He had learned coopering from a Bavarian brewer in Hamilton who needed strong hands and did not care what color they were. He had learned bridge carpentry from the Northern Pacific's construction crews in Minnesota, where the railway hired anyone who could swing an adze and did not fall off a scaffold. He had repaired brewery vats in St. Paul, railway cisterns in Brainerd, and grain elevator bins in Fargo, and he was passing through Wicklow Tank on his way to a job at a grain elevator west of Valley City when the freight wagon stopped to unload salt and canvas at Pike's store. He climbed off the wagon and stretched his back and looked south along the siding, and that was when he saw Ragna Asen trying to tighten an iron hoop on a fallen water tank with a fence staple and a hammer. He watched for 2 minutes. She was doing it wrong. She was hammering the staple against one side of the hoop, trying to force it downward over the stave, and the hoop was twisting instead of tightening. Every strike pushed the iron sideways rather than down, and the stave beneath was beginning to show hammer dents that would become cracks by tomorrow. But she was doing the right thing in the wrong way, and Moses Kettler knew the difference. He had watched apprentice coopers struggle with the same problem, trying to drive a hoop with force from one direction instead of pressure from two. The logic was correct. The method needed correction. That was fixable. He walked to the tank. Ragna looked up at him with the expression of a woman who had been looked at too many times in the past 5 days and expected nothing good from any of it. "You have the eye," Moses said. "You lack the tools. I have a hammer and a staple. You have a hammer and a staple, and in about 4 more strikes, you will have a cracked stave and a hoop that will never seat again." He set his tool bag on the frozen ground and opened it. Inside were the instruments of 30 years of working with curved wood: hoop drivers, stave joiners, a croze, a howl, a brace and bit, a draw knife, a set of paired wooden wedges worn smooth from use. "May I?" Ragna stepped back. Moses knelt beside the hoop and placed 2 wooden wedges on opposite sides, each one angled between the iron band and the stave beneath. He tapped the left wedge with the hammer, then the right, then the left again. The hoop slid downward evenly, a 1/4 inch on each side, without twisting, without denting the wood. He tapped again. The hoop seated with a low sound, almost musical, and the stave beneath it groaned and pressed tighter against its neighbors. "Every strike must answer across the circle," Moses said. "You drive one side, the other side lifts. You drive both sides together, the whole ring comes down even, and every stave gets tighter. That is the principle. A barrel is not a wall. A wall pushes back. A barrel pushes inward." Ragna looked at the seated hoop. She looked at the wedges. She looked at Moses Kettler with the expression of a woman who has been building something alone and has just seen the first evidence that she might not have to. "My father was a cooper in Telemark," she said. "Then you know more than you think you do. You just have not done it with your hands yet." He stayed that night. He slept in the pump house on a pile of coal sacks after Brackett told him the stove worked and the door locked and nobody would bother him. In the morning, he came back to the tank with his tool bag and said he had missed the freight wagon west and would need to wait for the next one. The next freight was 4 days out. He did not say that he had watched the freight wagon leave and chosen not to be on it. Ragna did not ask. The first day of 1888, Moses and Ragna hung the partition. It was not a simple task. The partition had to span the full interior curve, roughly 24 feet along the arc at its widest, and hang from the top of the cylinder down to the floor, creating a sealed wall between the warm chamber and the entry throat. The wagon cover canvas was not wide enough. Ragna had spent 2 days sewing additional panels from a flour sack, a torn horse blanket she traded 2 pounds of flour for, and strips of wool cut from her own spare skirt. The result was a patchwork wall, ugly and uneven, but dense enough to block direct airflow. Moses showed her how to weight the bottom edge with stones wrapped in cloth, so the wind could not lift it, and how to overlap the seams by 4 inches, so air passing through one layer hit the next layer and slowed. He did not tell her these things. He did them, and she watched, and then she did the next seam herself while he watched. When she overlapped by only 2 inches, he said, "More." When she tried 3, he said, "More." At 4 inches, he nodded. "How do you know it is 4?" she asked. "Because I have sealed brewery vats where beer costs more than your life. And the man who owned the beer told me the same thing my teacher told him. Every seam is a river waiting to flow. You dam it once, it finds a way. You dam it twice, it slows. You dam it 3 times, it gives up." By noon, the partition hung from the top curve to the floor, weighted at the base, overlapped at every seam. Moses cut a slit in the lower left corner and hemmed it with a strip of canvas. The entry flap. You crawled through on your knees. It was not dignified. It was not meant to be. It was meant to keep the air inside from becoming the air outside. They lit the candle in the warm chamber and watched the flame. It burned straight. Moses moved his hand slowly around the partition's edge, feeling for leaks. He found 3. Ragna sealed them with the ash and clay mud. He found a 4th, at the top curve where the canvas did not press tight against the cedar. She stood on the sleeping shelf and packed the gap with straw ticking that Beret had brought in a sack the day before, saying nothing when she delivered it, saying nothing when she left. The candle burned straight. Moses sat in the warm chamber and looked at the space. 8 feet deep, 15 feet wide at shoulder height. The sleeping shelf ran across the middle height, 3 feet off the curved floor. Above the shelf, the cedar ceiling arched to its peak, where the vent hole, still unsized, still uncut to proper dimension, let in a coin of gray light. "You need the vent wider," he said, "and you need a cover on it. If I make it wider, I lose heat. If you do not make it wider, you lose your children." He said it flatly, without drama, the way a man states a fact he has learned from experience he would rather not have. He told her about a brewery cellar in St. Paul, where a man had sealed a room to keep the cold out and burned a charcoal brazier inside for warmth. The room was tight. The charcoal burned clean. The man went to sleep warm and did not wake up. The air had gone bad. There was no vent, and the charcoal consumed the breath in the room faster than the cracks could replace it. "A candle will not kill you as fast as charcoal," Moses said, "but a candle and 3 children and 2 adults in a sealed room will make the air thick enough to make the youngest one sick before the oldest one notices. You need a vent. You need it at the top, where the bad air collects, and you need it open enough that you can feel cold air moving in at the bottom. Then the room will be colder. The room will be colder and your children will be alive. That is the trade." He used his brace and bit, a tool Ragnar had never operated, to widen the existing vent hole at the top of the curve from a thumb's width to a fist's width. He cut a sliding cover from a flattened lard can and attached it with a bent nail so it could open and close. Open for air, closed part way for warmth, never closed all the way. He made Ragnar repeat it. "If the vent sings in the wind, what do you do?" "I do not close it all the way." "Why?" "Better cold breath than no breath." He nodded. The 2nd day of January, they built the lamp box, a nail keg filled with sand with a flat stone on top to hold the lamp base steady. Moses positioned it against the closed end of the tank, where the cedar curve created a natural reflector that bounced the lamp's warmth back into the chamber. He showed Eli how to trim the wick so it burned with a long, steady flame instead of a short, smoky one. A long flame gave more heat and less soot. A smoky flame meant the oil was burning dirty, and dirty burning meant bad air accumulating faster. The 3rd day, they banked the north-facing curve. This was the hardest work. The north side of the tank faced the prevailing winter wind, and the ground there was frozen so hard that Ragnar's hand axe bounced off it without breaking the surface. Moses borrowed a pick from Brackett and spent 2 hours chopping frozen clay from the draw, while Ragnar mixed it with ash, grass, and snow into a packing mud that she pressed into the gap between the tank's belly and the earth. They built the bank 2 feet high along the entire north curve, a wall of frozen mud that would harden into something close to stone when the next cold snap hit. Kittle's cough had changed. It was no longer the wet, tearing sound from the first day. It was drier now, shallower, as if the warmth inside the tank, such as it was, had begun to loosen whatever had settled in his chest. Ragnar did not trust it. A dry cough could mean improvement, or it could mean the wet had gone deeper, below where coughing could reach. She brewed more willow bark tea and made him drink it on the sleeping shelf, where the air was warmest. On the 4th day of January, Brackett came to inspect. He did not announce his visit. He walked from the depot with his hands in his pockets and his hat pulled low, the way he walked everywhere, as if he were leaning into a wind that existed only for him. He ducked into the entry throat, crawled through the partition flap, and stood in the warm chamber with his head bent under the curve of the ceiling. He looked at the partition. He looked at the shelf. He looked at the lamp box and the vent and the mud bank visible through the cedar, where a stave had cracked and been sealed from outside. He looked at the thermometer. It read 38 degrees. 38, he said. 38 at shelf height, Ragnar said. 41 near the ceiling, 30 near the floor. Outside is 11. I know. Brackett stood in the warm chamber for a long moment. He was calculating. Ragnar could see it in his face, the same expression she had seen when he counted rail ties or measured clearances. He was measuring the gap between 38 and the temperature at which a child's lungs stopped working, and he was measuring the gap between 11 and the temperature at which the prairie killed you in your sleep. And he was comparing the 2 gaps and arriving at a number that surprised him. "It is not warm," he said. "No, but it is not 11. No." He looked at Moses. Moses looked back. 2 men who understood structures, arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. "It may hold in still cold," Brackett said, "but a blow is different. Wind does not just make it colder. Wind finds every leak and turns it into a river. A blow will test every seam you have sealed and every joint you have packed. If you have one weak point, the wind will find it and open it, and the temperature in here will drop 20 degrees in an hour." "Then we have no weak points," Ragnar said. Brackett looked at her. He almost said something. Then he said, "I have a piece of stovepipe in the coal shed. It is bent and too short for a stove. You can have it for the entry tunnel to break the wind before it reaches the flap." He left. He came back an hour later with the stovepipe section and 2 bent tower braces that he said were too damaged for railway use. He dropped them outside the tank and walked away without speaking. Ragnar and Moses used the tower braces to frame an entry tunnel, a 6-foot passage leading to the partition flap, roofed with canvas, walled with sod blocks cut from the thawed south face of the draw. The stovepipe section became a wind baffle at the tunnel's mouth, angled so that wind entering the opening hit a turn and lost its force before reaching the flap. By January 6th, the warm chamber thermometer read 43 at shelf height after the lamp had been burning for 2 hours. 43. Still not safe, but closer. Getting closer. On the night of January 7th, someone stole 2 of the tower braces from the entry tunnel frame. Ragnar woke to the sound of wood scraping on frozen ground and crawled out to find 2 braces gone and boot prints in the snow that led toward Pike's store. She could not prove it was Pike's men. She could not prove anything. But the entry tunnel sagged without its braces, and the canvas roof dropped low enough that snow could collect on it and push it down further, and the wind found the gap where the braces had been and pushed cold air into the tunnel and through the partition flap. The thermometer dropped 7 degrees overnight. Moses repaired the tunnel the next morning with scrap lumber from the pump house pile, bracing it differently, lashing the frame with rawhide strips instead of resting it on unsecured braces. Anything that could be lifted could be stolen. Anything lashed had to be cut, and cutting took time and noise and the risk of being caught. "Pike will not stop," Moses said. "I know. He wants the iron and the cedar. The iron is worth more to him than your children." "I know that too." Moses tied the last lashing and tested the frame. It held. "Then you need to be finished before his letter comes back. A paper from the railway will give him what the town will not, the right to call you a trespasser." Ragnar looked east, where the rail line disappeared into white horizon. The letter was out there somewhere, moving from desk to desk in an office building where men who had never seen Wicklow tank would decide whether a dead man's widow could keep a broken water barrel. She went back to pressing mud. By January 10th, the tank was as ready as Ragnar could make it. The warm chamber was sealed on all sides. The mud and sod apron covered the lower curve to a height of 2 feet, frozen hard as brick. The entry tunnel had a framed roof, sod walls, and the stovepipe wind baffle. The partition hung weighted and overlapped. The vent was cut, covered, and functional. The sleeping shelf was lashed and tested. The lamp box sat on its sand base with enough oil for 6 days of careful burning. Moses had shown Ragnar one more technique. Heated stones. You place flat stones near the lamp, let them absorb warmth for an hour, then wrap them in cloth and tuck them under the sleeping shelf or against the children's feet. The stones held heat longer than the air did, and they released it slowly, raising the temperature in the shelf zone without burning more oil. That morning, Ragnar took the first full set of measurements. Outside at dawn, 4 degrees below zero. Inside the entry tunnel, 16. Inside the warm chamber at floor level, 32. On the sleeping shelf after the lamp and 2 heated stones, 51. Near the curved ceiling, where warm air collected against the cedar, 58. 58 degrees. Not miraculous. Not the 70 that would make it comfortable. But 58 degrees above a shelf where children slept, while the prairie outside sat at 4 below, was a gap of 62 degrees. The cedar walls, the mud bank, the canvas partition, the sod tunnel, and the lamp together were holding 62 degrees of difference between life and death. Ragnar wrote the numbers on the inside of a stave with a charcoal stub. She wanted to see them. She wanted to believe them. She wanted to check them again tomorrow and the next day and see if they held. Beret came that afternoon and sat in the warm chamber and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "It is warmer than my soddy. Your soddy has a stove. My soddy has a stove and 4 walls and a sod roof, and it is colder than this barrel. Because your soddy has corners. The wind hits the corners and pries, and your soddy has a flat roof. Snow piles on a flat roof and presses down. The tank has no corners and no flat surface. The wind goes over it. The snow goes over it. Beret looked at her. You sound like your father. My father built barrels that held boiling water. I built a barrel that holds children. The principle is the same. Beret left and came back an hour later with a second lamp and a jar of rendered tallow. She did not explain. She set them inside the partition flap and said, "For the baby's cough." With 2 lamps burning, the shelf temperature rose to 55 degrees. The ceiling near the vent reached 61. But the vent was the question. Moses had left that morning to help repair a blocked pump line 6 miles west of the siding. A section crew had sent word that ice was choking the intake, and Moses was the only man at Wicklow Tank who understood pump housings well enough to clear one without cracking the casing. He said he would be back by nightfall. Before he left, he put his hand on the vent cover and said, "If the vent sings, do not close it all the way. Better cold breath than no breath. Promise me." "I promise." "And keep the stones warm, 2 at a time. Rotate them. Do not let all of them cool at once." He picked up his tool bag and walked to the pump cart. Ragna watched him go and felt the particular cold that comes from knowing the person who understands your structure better than you do is walking away from it. The morning of January 12th began warm, not spring warm, not safe warm, but warm enough that Kittle asked to play outside, and warm enough that Beret's boys were throwing snowballs at the coal shed, and warm enough that 2 men outside Pike's store took off their hats and said it felt like the back of winter was breaking. Ragna did not trust it. She had lived through Dakota winters for 4 years, and she knew that warmth in January was not a gift. It was a lure. The prairie offered warmth the way a card dealer offers a winning hand, to make you careless before the real game began. She saw it first as a shimmer, not on the horizon, on the rail. The iron track caught the light differently, and Ragna, who had spent 5 days staring at that track waiting for freight wagons and letters and the tools of her own survival, noticed the change. Fine ice crystals were crawling along the rail from the northwest, pushed by a wind that was not yet strong enough to feel, but was visible in the way the crystals moved, low, fast, and purposeful, like insects fleeing something behind them. She looked northwest. The sky was blue directly overhead, but along the horizon, where the prairie met the sky in a line so flat it looked drawn with a ruler, there was a smudge, not a cloud, not a shadow, a thickening of the air itself, as if the sky were bruising. She picked up Marte, took Kittle by the hand, and walked to the tank. Eli saw the telegraph runner, a boy of maybe 14, sprinting from the depot with a yellow slip in his fist and an expression that said he did not fully understand what the slip meant, but understood enough to run. He was heading for Brackett's office. The slip said what the Weather Service had been trying to say for 12 hours through wires that were already failing as the storm chewed through the poles east of Huron. A deep cold front was moving southeast across Dakota Territory with high winds and heavy snow and temperatures that would fall faster than anyone in the settled regions had ever measured. The warning was already too late for half the territory. Schools were in session. Children were walking home. Settlers were in their fields checking stock. The warm morning had pulled people out of their shelters the way a retreating tide pulls fish from their rocks, and the wave that was coming would find them in the open. Ragna sealed the partition flap with an extra layer of canvas and lit both lamps. The wind hit Wicklow Tank at 1:30 in the afternoon, like a wall made of ground glass. There was no buildup, no gradual increase. One moment the air was still and strangely warm, and the next moment the world turned white and the sound was so loud that Marte screamed and pressed her face into Ragna's chest, and Kittle covered his ears and Eli grabbed the sleeping shelf with both hands as if the tank might roll. The temperature outside dropped 30 degrees in less than an hour. The wind came from the northwest at 50 miles an hour, gusting higher, carrying snow so fine it was not snow at all but ice dust, particles so small they found every gap, every seam, every opening in every structure in Wicklow Tank. The ice dust did not fall. It flew. It flew sideways, then upward, then in spirals that made it impossible to see more than an arm's length. People who tried to breathe through the wind found their lungs filling with ice. People who turned their backs to it found the ice driving through their coats. Inside the tank, Rana heard the wind hit the curved cedar wall and slide over it. She heard it. The sound was different from wind hitting a flat wall. A flat wall catches wind and shakes. A curved wall deflects it, and the wind accelerates over the curve and away, leaving a pocket of still air behind. The tank shuddered once when the first gust hit, and then it settled, and the cedar groaned but held, and the snow streamed over the top like water over a stone. The first hour was manageable. The entry tunnel took the brunt of the initial assault. The canvas roof snapped and tore at one corner, and ice dust poured through the gap into the tunnel. The partition held, but the temperature in the warm chamber dropped 4 degrees in 20 minutes. Ragna and Eli crawled into the tunnel and pinned the torn canvas with a section of iron hoop, bending it over the tear like a clamp. The wind screamed through the stovepipe baffle and threw ice into their faces. Eli's fingers turned white. They crawled back through the partition flap and sealed it behind them with Ragna's body weight. The second hour, the mud bank proved its worth. Ragna pressed her ear against the lower curve of the tank where the mud apron covered the outside, and she heard nothing. No wind, no whistle. The mud had frozen into a shell harder than the cedar itself, and the wind could not penetrate it. The lower third of the warm chamber stayed warmer than the upper 2/3, which was wrong. Heat rises, and the warmest air should have been at the top. But the mud bank was trapping ground-level heat and stopping the convective loop that would have pulled warmth out through the base. The floor was warmer than it should have been. The ceiling was colder than it should have been. The shelf, in between, was holding. 46 degrees at shelf height, down from 51 that morning. Losing ground, but slowly. The third hour brought the first complication that could kill them. Perret's stovepipe collapsed. The wind found the joint where the pipe entered the sod roof and worked it loose, inch by inch, until the pipe fell inward and landed on the stove and filled the soddy with smoke. Barry's oldest boy, Oddman, 12 years old, panicked. He grabbed his younger brother and ran for the door, but the smoke and the whiteout outside disoriented him. His brother pulled free and crawled back inside. Oddman kept running. He ran north toward the rail, because the rail was the only landmark he knew. He hit the pump house wall with his shoulder and fell and got up and kept moving. He could not see the tank. He could not see anything. The world was white noise and ice. He ran until he hit the curved belly of the tank and slid along it, feeling cedar under his hands, until he found the entry tunnel by falling into it. Ragna heard the sound, a body hitting canvas, a voice screaming something Norwegian that the wind tore apart. She crawled through the partition and found Oddman face down in the tunnel, his coat crusted with ice, his hands bare, his eyes wide with the particular terror of a child who has been lost in something too large to understand. She dragged him through the partition flap. Eli held the canvas shut. Ragna wrapped Oddman's hands in wool strips and pressed them against her stomach and talked to him in Norwegian, fast, low, the words themselves less important than the sound of a human voice saying something that was not the wind. Now there were 5 people in the warm chamber. Ragna, Eli, Kittel, Marte, and Oddmund. 5 bodies producing heat, 5 bodies producing moisture, 5 bodies consuming air. The thermometer dropped to 41 as the flap opened and rose to 44 within the hour, as the extra bodies warmed the space. But the vent was the problem. 5 people breathing in a sealed chamber 8 feet deep meant the air would go bad faster than it would with 4. Ragna could feel it, a heaviness at the top of the warm chamber, a thickness that made her head swim when she stood on the shelf to check the vent. The vent was singing. The wind outside passed over the hole at the top of the curve, and the pressure difference created a sound, a high, thin whistle that rose and fell with the gusts. Moses had warned her about this. The singing meant the vent was working, pulling stale air out as the wind created suction over the opening. If she closed the vent, the singing would stop, and the room would warm by a few degrees, and the air would slowly turn to poison. She left the vent open. The singing continued. The temperature at ceiling height dropped to 39. The shelf held at 44. The fourth hour brought the second complication. Marte's cough returned. Not the dry cough of the past few days, but something deeper, wetter, pulled from a place in her chest that the willow bark tea had not reached. She coughed and coughed again, and each cough consumed air that the room could not easily replace. Ragna trimmed both lamp wicks to their lowest sustainable flame. Less fire meant less air consumed. It also meant less heat. The shelf temperature dropped to 41. She wrapped heated stones in cloth and placed them against Marte's chest and back, creating a cocoon of warmth around the child's body, while the air around her cooled. Kittle sat beside his sister and held her hand. He did not cough. The willow bark tea, the warmer air, the days of rest on the shelf had done something his body could not have done in the bunkhouse. He was getting better while his sister got worse, and the look on his face said he understood the math even if he could not put numbers to it. If you're invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because the next choice decides whether warmth saves them or poisons them. The fifth hour. The vent clogged. Ice had been building on the outer lip of the vent hole for hours, forming a rim of rime that grew inward with each gust of ice-laden wind. Now the rim closed the opening to less than a thumb's width, and the singing stopped, and the silence that replaced it was worse than any sound the storm had made. Ragna knew what the silence meant. The vent was sealed. The room was sealed. 5 people and 2 lamps were consuming the air in a space 8 feet deep and 15 feet wide, and there was no way for fresh air to enter except through the leaks in the partition, which were small, which she had spent 5 days sealing because that was the whole point. She had built the room too well. She climbed the inside curve on the notched braces that Moses had cut as footholds. 3 notches in the cedar stave, each one deep enough for a toe, leading up to the vent. She stood at the top of the curve with her head pressed against the cedar ceiling and her father's cooper knife, a short, hooked blade he had sent with her to America as a wedding gift, in her right hand. Her injured palm, the one she had cut on the hoop rivet 3 days ago, reopened as she gripped the knife. Blood ran down her wrist and into her sleeve. She pushed the blade through the vent hole and scraped. Ice shattered and fell outward. The wind hit the blade and nearly tore it from her hand. She scraped again. The rime broke away in chunks, and the vent opened, and the singing returned. Loud, shrill, angry, and cold air poured through the hole and hit her face, and she gasped at the shock of it, 20 degrees colder than the air in the chamber, and for a moment she could not breathe because the cold went into her lungs like water. The temperature at ceiling height dropped to 34. The shelf dropped to 38. She had traded 10 degrees of warmth for the ability to keep breathing. She climbed down and wrapped her bleeding palm in a strip from her skirt and sat beside Marty and Kittle and Eli and Oddmund and listened to the storm and the singing vent and the sound of 5 people breathing air that was cold and thin but not poison. Outside, the world was ending. Not the world of Wicklow Tank. Pike's storage shanty lost its roof sometime in the 4th hour. The wind peeled the tar paper and scrap lumber upward like a hand opening a box and scattered it across the prairie. Nate Rusk, Pike's hired man, tried to cross from the shanty to the depot. He made it 30 yards before the whiteout swallowed him. He was not seen again until the next morning, when Brackett found him curled against the base of the water pump with his hands frozen to the iron handle and his eyes open. He was alive, barely, because the pump housing had blocked enough wind to keep the ice from filling his lungs. His hands would never fully close again. Beret's Sadi survived, but the smoke from the fallen stovepipe had driven her and her younger son to the floor, where they breathed through wet cloth for 3 hours until the wind shifted enough to create a draft through the broken pipe joint. They were alive. They were not well. The school lean-to, a half-mile east, collapsed under the weight of drifted snow. No children were inside. The teacher had dismissed early when the warm morning seemed like a gift. That decision, made out of kindness, saved 6 lives. Inside the tank, the 6th hour passed. The lamps burned low and steady. Ragna rotated the heated stones. two warming near the lamp, two wrapped against the children, cycling every 40 minutes. The shelf temperature stabilized at 40 degrees, the ceiling at 36, the floor at 29. And then, near midnight, with the two lamps burning their lowest, and the children sleeping on the shelf in a tangle of wool and canvas, in each other's warmth, the thermometer near the curved ceiling touched 47 degrees. The combined heat of 5 bodies, 2 small flames, and 4 heated stones had been collecting in the upper curve of the cedar chamber for hours, and the cedar sews 2¼ inches thick, dense with the natural oils that made western red cedar resist rot and hold temperature, was absorbing that heat and radiating it back slowly, the way a stone wall radiates the sun's warmth after dark. At 2 in the morning, with the lamp wicks trimmed to the edge of survival, and the heated stones pressed against the children's bodies, and the vent singing its thin, constant note, the thermometer near the curved ceiling read 51 degrees. By 4 in the morning, with Oddman's body heat added to the chamber's total, and the children breathing slowly in sleep, and the mud bank holding the base temperature steady, the highest reading was 58 degrees, and the shelf where the children slept was 53, and the cedar walls were warm to the touch. At dawn, gray, howling, the storm still raging but the wind dropping from 50 miles an hour to something closer to 30. The thermometer near the curved ceiling of the warm chamber read 64 degrees, and at 7 in the morning, after Ragna had rotated the last pair of heated stones and wrapped them in cloth and placed them beneath the shelf directly under Marte's sleeping body, the thermometer at the highest point of the cedar curve, the point where all the warmth of all the bodies and all the lamps and all the stones collected and pressed against the wood that held it, read 70 degrees. 70 degrees. While the wind outside carried ice at 30 miles an hour, and the temperature at the depot thermometer read 26 degrees below zero. Ragna looked at the number. She did not celebrate. She did not cry. She pressed her bandaged palm against the cedar wall and felt the warmth in the wood and thought of her father's hand on a barrel in Telemark, his thumb on the seam, his voice saying, "A good barrel does not waste what you put inside it." She had put her children inside. The barrel had not wasted them. The storm broke on the morning of January 13th. The wind dropped. The snow stopped. The sky appeared, pale, exhausted, empty, and the temperature remained at 19 below, but the air was still, and in still air, 19 below was survivable. In wind, it was not. Brackett was the first to reach the tank. He came from the depot with 2 section men, following the rails south to the pump house, and then by memory to where the tank lay, because the drifts had buried every landmark between the buildings. The entry tunnel was packed with hard snow to within a foot of the ceiling. They dug it clear with shovels. The stovepipe baffle was buried. The sod walls had held. Brackett crawled through the tunnel and through the partition flap and stood in the warm chamber with snow on his knees and ice in his beard and looked at what he had expected to be a grave. It was not a grave. It was damp and close, and smelled of tallow and cedar and unwashed wool and the particular thick scent of people who have breathed the same air for 18 hours. The 2 lamps were out, the oil exhausted sometime before dawn. But the thermometer on the wall read 46 degrees. The children were asleep on the shelf. Oddman was awake, holding Marte's hand. Ragna was sitting with her back against the closed end of the tank, her bandaged hand in her lap, her eyes open. She looked at Brackett. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the children. He looked at the cedar walls, at the mud bank visible through the cracked stave, at the vent still singing faintly in the remaining wind. His admission was short. He was not a man who spent words. "I counted walls," he said. "You counted leaks." He paused. "I was wrong." Ragna stood up. Her legs shook. She had not stood in 14 hours. "Is Moses back?" she asked. Brackett's face changed. The expression that replaced the surprise was the one Ragna had feared since the moment Moses walked west with his tool bag toward a pump line 6 miles away and a storm that neither of them had known was coming. "He has not come in," Brackett said. Ragna looked at the partition. She looked at the vent. She looked at the warm chamber that Moses Kettler had helped her build, and that had held her children alive through a night that killed people in houses with stoves and 4 walls and 6 cords of wood. She did not say anything. She crawled through the partition flap and through the entry tunnel and stood in the white silence of the morning after, and she looked west along the rail, where the snow lay flat and featureless and gave nothing back. They found Moses Kettler on the afternoon of January 13th, 2 miles west of the siding, in a pump shed that he had sealed from the inside with his own coat and a sheet of tin roofing he had pried from the wall. The pump shed was not built for habitation. It was built to keep rain off of valve housing. But Moses had done what he knew how to do. He had found the leaks, stopped the wind, and made the smallest possible room out of whatever was at hand. He had stuffed his tool bag into the gap under the door. He had wedged the tin sheet across the window opening and packed snow around its edges. He had crouched in the corner farthest from the wind side and wrapped his arms around his knees and waited. When Brackett and 2 section men broke the ice off the pump shed door and pulled it open, Moses was conscious. His fingers were white. His lips were blue. His cough, which had been with him since November, was now something worse, a sound that came from deep in his chest like water moving through a cracked pipe. But he was alive, and when he saw Brackett, he said, "How is the tank?" "The tank held," Brackett said. "Your vent held. The children are alive." Moses closed his eyes and nodded once, and the section men carried him back to Wicklow Tank on a plank sled. And Ragna met them at the pump house and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the look on her face did not already contain. They put Moses on a cot in the pump house beside the stove. Ragna brought him broth from a pot Beret had started on her repaired stove. He drank it and coughed and drank more and said, "The vent. Did you have to clear it?" "Twice?" "With what?" "My father's Cooper knife." He almost laughed. The laugh turned into a cough that lasted 30 seconds and left him gray. He lay back on the cot and looked at the ceiling and said, "A Cooper's daughter clearing a vent with a Cooper's knife in a Cooper's barrel. Your father would have understood." "My father would have built a better barrel." "Your father did not have to build one in 6 days with mud and canvas and a cracked thermometer. You built what the time allowed. That is not less. That is different." The days after the blizzard were accounting. Every settlement on the northern Pacific line between Fargo and the Missouri counted its living and its dead, and the numbers that came back along the repaired telegraph wires were worse than anyone had imagined. Schools had been in session when the storm hit. Children had been walking home. Families had been caught between buildings, between towns, between the warm morning and the frozen afternoon. The dead numbered in the hundreds across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota. Many of them were children. At Wicklow Tank, Nate Rusk was alive but would never close his hands fully again. The school lean-to was destroyed. Beret's soddy had held, but the stovepipe joint needed rebuilding. Pike's storage shanty was gone, the roof scattered across the prairie, the contents exposed to snow that had drifted 4 feet high through the open walls. His flour was ruined. His lamp oil barrels had cracked in the cold. His canvas stock was buried under ice. And the water tank, the widow's barrel, the thing they had laughed about over coffee in Pike's store, was standing, rimed white with ice on the outside, the mud bank hard as stone, the entry tunnel packed with snow that Ragna and Eli had already begun to dig clear. Standing, intact, warm enough inside that the thermometer still read 46 degrees 12 hours after the lamps had gone out. Brackett came back on the 14th, not to inspect this time, to ask questions. He brought a notebook, the small leather-bound book he used to record rail measurements and crew hours, and he sat on the sleeping shelf in the warm chamber and asked Ragna to explain what she had done and why. "Start with the mud," he said. "The mud stops underdrafts. The wind cannot push through it the way it pushes through a gap between a wall and the ground, and when it freezes, it becomes harder than the wood." The partition. The partition makes the room smaller. A smaller room holds heat from fewer sources. 5 bodies and 2 lamps can warm 8 feet. They cannot warm 15. The vent. The vent keeps the air alive. Moses said a sealed room becomes a grave. The vent lets the bad air out at the top and the fresh air in at the bottom. The shelf. Warm air rises. The children sleep high. The floor is always coldest. The curve. Ragna paused. This was the piece that no one had asked about, because no one had thought about it, because everyone in Wicklow Tank thought about shelter in terms of 4 walls and a flat roof, and had never considered why those shapes lost heat the way they did. A flat wall catches wind, she said. The wind pushes against it, and the wall pushes back, and the force finds every crack and pries it open. A curved wall does not catch the wind. The wind goes over it. There's no flat surface to push against. And inside, a curve has no corners. Corners are where cold collects. Corners are where 2 walls meet and leave a gap. A barrel has no gaps because every stave is pressing against the next one. Brackett wrote this down. He was not a man who changed his mind easily or often, but he was a man who understood structures, and what Ragna was describing was not magic or luck. It was engineering. The same engineering that made a boiler hold pressure and a bridge hold weight. She had applied it to survival, and it had worked, and the evidence was sleeping on a shelf above his head. He closed the notebook and said, 3 families have asked me if you will show them how to do this. Show them what? They do not have water tanks. They have sheds. They have grain bins. They have sod walls that leak. They want to know how to make a room inside a room that holds heat the way yours does. Ragna looked at the cedar walls. She had not thought past the storm. She had thought about surviving the night and then surviving the next morning, and then clearing the tunnel and feeding the children and checking on Moses. She had not thought about what came after survival. Send them to me, she said. I will not sell it. I will show them. They came in 1s and 2s over the following week. A section worker's wife named Hannah, whose shanty had lost its south wall in the storm and was now patched with canvas that bellied in every gust. A Norwegian farmer named Tollef, whose grain bin stood empty because the harvest had been poor, and who wanted to know if an empty grain bin could be made livable the way an empty water tank could. A woman named Clara, who turned out to be Lucius Pike's niece, though she did not mention this and Ragna did not ask. Ragna showed them with a candle. She lit the candle and held it near a seam in the partition. The flame burned straight. She moved it to a gap she had deliberately left unsealed, a thumb-width opening where 2 canvas panels met. The flame bent sideways and flickered. That is a leak, she said. If the flame moves, the wind is entering. If the wind enters, the heat leaves. Your job is to make the flame burn straight everywhere, every seam, every joint, every corner. If you do not have a candle, wet your hand and hold it near the gap. If your hand feels cold air, the gap is a leak. She showed them the mud mixture, clay, ash, chopped grass, snow melted to slush. She showed them the 4-inch overlap on canvas seams. She showed them the weighted bottom edge. She showed them the high vent and the low intake, and said, the room must breathe. If you seal it completely, the air goes bad. If you leave it open, the heat goes. The vent is the balance. High for the stale air that rises. Low for the fresh air that sinks. Never close the high vent all the way. Moses taught me that, and Moses is alive because he understood air before he understood wood. Tollef asked how large the inner room should be. Ragna said it depended on how many people and how many heat sources. 2 people and 1 lamp could warm 6 feet, 4 people and 2 lamps could warm 8. More than that, you needed a brazier or a stove, and if you had a stove, you did not need her method. You needed a stovepipe that drew properly and a chimney that did not collapse. The teaching took something from Ragna that she had not expected to lose. Each explanation cost energy she did not have in surplus. Each demonstration meant time away from maintaining the tank, feeding the children, checking on Moses, and watching the northwest sky for the next sign of weather. She was not a teacher. She was a woman who had built one thing to save her children and was now being asked to explain it to people who had watched her do it and called it foolishness. But she explained, and the people who listened went back to their shanties and their sheds and their sod houses and began pressing mud into gaps and hanging canvas partitions and cutting vent holes in places where vent holes had never been, and the candle flames that had danced sideways in those rooms began slowly to burn straight. Moses recovered slowly. The pump house cot was not comfortable, but the stove worked, and Brackett kept the coal supply steady, and Ragna brought food twice a day, soup made from salt pork and the last of the flour, stretched with prairie turnip roots that Beret showed her how to dig from the frozen ground. Moses ate and coughed and slept and ate again, and by the 3rd week of January, he could sit upright without the gray color coming into his face. On the 4th day of his recovery, Ragna brought the broken bottom head of the tank, the circular piece that had split when the tower fell, leaving the open end. She had dragged it to the pump house on a sled made from 2 braces and a plank. "Can this be a door?" she asked. Moses looked at it. The head was a circle of cedar staves, held together by a single iron band, cracked down the middle where impact had split 3 staves lengthwise. It was not usable as is, but the 2 halves, if rejoined and reinforced, could be hung across the open end of the tank as a proper closing. Not a canvas flap, but a wooden door that the wind could not tear. "It can be a door," he said, "but not with that crack. You need to scarf the broken staves." "Show me." He showed her. A scarf joint, cutting the broken ends at matching angles so they overlapped and could be pegged together, the joint stronger than the original wood because the angled faces gave more gluing surface. He could not do the cutting himself. His hands were still too stiff from the frostbite, but he held the stave steady while Ragna used his draw knife to shape the angle, and he told her when the angle was right and when it was wrong and why. "Too steep," he said. "The peg will split it. Shallower. Let the wood carry the load across the grain, not against it." She cut again. "Shallower." He nodded. They worked together for 3 days on the door. Moses directed. Ragna cut, shaped, pegged, and fitted. Eli mixed hide glue from scraps that Beret brought from a butchered cow, boiling the scraps in the cook pot until the liquid was thick and amber. Kittle, whose cough was now just a dry rasp that came twice a day instead of every minute, carried water from the pump and stacked the cedar shavings for kindling. The door was not beautiful. It was a circle of patched cedar with a scarf joint down the middle and 6 pegs driven through and 2 rawhide hinges attached to the intact hoops of the tank. But when Ragna and Moses hung it on the open end and pushed it shut, the warm chamber temperature rose 4 degrees in an hour. The canvas flap had been adequate. The cedar door was better. Wood against wood, sealed with the same ash clay mud, pressing tight the way every other stave in the tank pressed against its neighbor. Moses stood back and looked at the door and said, "Your father made vats. I made vats. We come from different countries and different coopers and different wood, and we made the same door." Ragna said, "You made the door. I followed your hands." "You followed my hands because your father's hands had already taught yours what to look for. I did not teach you coopering, I reminded you of it." It was the closest Moses came to sentiment, and it lasted exactly that long. Then he pointed at the hinge and said the rawhide would stretch in warm weather and the door would sag, and she should replace it with iron strap hinges when she could afford them. And Ragna said she could not afford them, and Moses said she would be able to afford them once Pike's letter came back, and the railway told him the tank was not his to take. "You think the letter will say that?" "I think Brackett has already sent his own letter. And I think the railway cares more about a section boss who keeps trains running than a storekeeper who sells overpriced flour." Pike's letter came back on the 28th of January, carried on a freight that also brought mail, salt, and a replacement stovepipe for the depot. The letter was from a clerk in the Northern Pacific's land office in St. Paul. It said the water tank at Wicklow Tank Siding had been listed as damaged beyond repair following the November storm, and was designated for disposal at the discretion of the local section authority. The local section authority was Amos Brackett. Brackett read the letter in Pike's store, with Pike standing behind the counter and 2 section workers warming their hands at the stove. He read it once, folded it, and looked at Pike. "Disposal at my discretion," Brackett said. "My discretion is that the tank stays where it is and the widow keeps it." Pike's face did not change. Pike's face rarely changed, but his voice, when it came, had the controlled edge of a man who has lost a hand he expected to win and is already calculating the next play. "The tank is one thing," Pike said. "The iron hoops and the tower braces are another. Those have salvage value. The railway may dispose of the tank, but the hardware is attached to the tank. If you want to remove 9 iron hoops from a structure that is currently housing a woman and 3 children who survived a storm that killed your hired man's hands, you are welcome to try, but you will do it in front of everyone at this siding, and I will make sure they are watching." Pike said nothing. Brackett left. The 2 section workers followed him. Pike stood behind his counter and looked at the letter on the wood and did not pick it up. He did not try to take the tank. He did not try to remove the hoops. But he raised the price of lamp oil by 40% that week, and canvas went from 8 cents a yard to 14, and nails, dow, which Ragna needed for the door hinges, and a dozen other small repairs went from 2 cents a pound to 5. The war was not over. It had changed shape. Pike could not take the tank by force or by paper. So he would take it by inches, by making every supply Ragna needed cost more than she could pay, by squeezing the margin between survival and failure until the gap was too narrow for a woman with 3 children and no income to cross. Ragna understood this. She had grown up in a village where merchants operated the same way, and she recognized the strategy the way you recognize a tune you heard in childhood, instantly, without needing to think about where you learned it. She began to barter. Old flour sacks, washed and dried, sewn into canvas panels. Rawhide scraps from Beret's cow, cut into ties and hinge straps. Ash from every fire at the siding, collected in buckets and mixed with clay for mud. Straw ticking from worn-out mattresses, pulled apart and used as insulation. Everything that Pike did not control became material. Everything he could not price became currency. Moses watched this from his cot in the pump house, where his cough was improving but his color was not, and said, "You are building a supply line out of garbage. I am building a supply line out of what Pike cannot touch. If he raises the price of nails, I use pegs. If he raises the price of canvas, I use flour sacks. If he raises the price of lamp oil, I burn tallow. And if he raises the price of food?" Ragna did not answer that question. She could not answer it, because food was the one thing she could not replace with salvage. Flour was flour, salt pork was salt pork, and Pike held the only store within 12 miles. The secondary crisis came not from the sky, but from the ground. March of 1888 brought a thaw, 3 days of temperatures above freezing, which sounds like relief but was not, because the thaw melted the top layer of snow and the meltwater ran downhill and pooled in every low spot on the prairie, and then the temperature dropped again and the water froze, and every structure with a dirt floor became a structure with an ice floor. Beret's soddy flooded. The meltwater came through the base of the south wall, where the sod blocks met the ground, and pooled across the packed earth floor to a depth of 2 inches before it froze solid. Her stove sat on a sheet of ice. Her kindling was wet. Her younger son, Peter, who was 6, developed a fever that climbed for 2 days and would not break. Beret came to the tank on the second night of the fever. She did not ask for help. She said, "Peter cannot stay in the soddy. The floor is ice, and the stove will not draw because the fuel is wet." Ragna took Peter onto the sleeping shelf beside Marte and wrapped him in the warmest blanket and placed heated stones against his feet and chest. His fever was high enough that his skin felt like the stones themselves. She brewed willow bark tea and made him drink it, a sip at a time, through cracked lips. But one child in the tank was not the problem. The problem was the same problem it had always been, made larger. 3 other families at the siding had flooded floors. 2 had wet fuel. 1, a section worker named Decker, the same man who had come with Pike to threaten Ragna, had a wife and infant daughter in a shanty where water was seeping through the base of every wall. Tollef, the Norwegian farmer, came to Ragna and said, "Can you do for the grain bin what you did for the tank?" The grain bin was empty. A wooden cylinder 12 feet across and 8 feet tall, open at the top, sitting on a stone foundation behind the elevator platform. It was not a water tank. It was smaller, rougher, with gaps between the boards that you could see daylight through. But it was a cylinder. It had no corners, and it was raised off the ground on stones, which meant the meltwater flowed under it instead of through it. Ragna went to look at it. She brought the candle. She lit it inside the bin and watched the flame dance sideways in a dozen directions at once. Leaks everywhere, gaps in every board joint, the open top letting heat pour out like water from a bucket. She could not seal it the way she had sealed the tank. The tank had been tight from its original construction, coopered staves pressed by iron hoops, a structure designed to hold water. The grain bin was rough carpentry, built to hold wheat, not warmth, but the principle was the same. Shrink the room, stop the leaks, save the breath. She and Eli and Tolef spent 2 days building an inner chamber. Canvas panels from Ragna's barter stockpile hung from the top edge of the bin, creating a room 6 feet across inside the 12-foot cylinder. Mud packed into every gap in the lower boards, straw ticking layered between the canvas and the outer wall for insulation. A vent hole at the top. Ragna used Moses's brace and bit, which he loaned from his cot with the instruction to bring it back sharp, and a tin cover from a lard can lid. A sleeping shelf was harder in the smaller space, but Tolef built a low platform from scrap lumber, raised 1 foot off the floor, enough to keep sleepers above the cold layer. They moved Decker's wife and infant into the grain bin on the second evening. The candle burned straight inside the inner chamber. The thermometer X Brackett had loaned the cracked pump house thermometer again, with the same note still attached. Read 37 degrees at platform height after 1 lamp and 2 bodies had warmed the space for an hour. 37 was not 51. It was not the tank. But it was 37 instead of the 22 in Decker's flooded shanty, and the infant stopped shivering and slept, and Decker's wife looked at Ragna with an expression that held something more complicated than gratitude. 3 men from the siding came to watch the grain bin conversion. They stood outside and said nothing while Ragna showed Tolef how to check the vent and rotate the heated stones. One of the men was a teamster who had laughed in Pike's store about the widow's barrel. He did not laugh now. He watched Ragna's hands pressing mud into the gaps and asked quietly if the same method would work in a root cellar. "Does your root cellar have a vent?" Ragna asked. "No." "Then you will need to cut one, high, the size of your fist, with a cover you can close part way but never all the way." He nodded and left. The next morning, Ragna saw smoke rising from his root cellar through a new hole in the sod roof, and she knew he had cut the vent, and she knew the candle inside was burning straight, because the smoke rose vertically instead of leaning. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the next storm comes. Moses saw the grain bin from the pump house window. Ragna brought him there the next day, walking slowly because his breath came short and his legs were not steady. He stood inside the inner chamber and touched the canvas walls and the mud-packed joints and the vent cover and said nothing for a long time. "You did not copy the tank," he said finally. "I could not. The bin is different." "You copied the idea. The tank was the object. The idea is what survives." He coughed, and the cough was longer than it should have been, and when it stopped, his hand came away from his mouth with a color that Ragna saw and Moses did not show her. "A good barrel is not sealed shut," he said. "It holds what must live." He said it the way a man says something he has been thinking about for a long time and has finally decided is worth saying aloud. Ragna heard it, and she heard under it the thing he was not saying, that his cough was not getting better, that the night in the pump shed had settled something in his lungs that willow bark tea and coal stove warmth could not reach, and that the idea he had given her was the part of himself that would outlast the body carrying it. She did not say this. She said, "Come back to the tank. The pump house is drafty and the cot is too short for you." "The cot is fine." "The cot is not fine. You sound like a man sleeping in a draft." He moved to the tank that evening. She built a second shelf, lower than the children's, against the closed end where the air was warmest. He slept there and coughed less, and in the mornings he sat on the shelf and taught Eli how to read grain rot, how to press a thumbnail into cedar, and feel whether the wood was sound or whether the softness beneath the surface meant moisture had found its way in and was eating the fiber from within. Rot does not start on the surface, he told Eli. Rot starts where you cannot see it. By the time you see it, the wood is half gone. You have to feel for it. Press and listen. Sound wood resists. Rotten wood gives. Eli pressed her thumb into the stave and said, "This one gives. Mark it. Your mother will seal it from outside." Ragna sealed it that afternoon. She thought about Moses's words while she packed the mud. Rot starts where you cannot see it. She thought about Pike, whose visible attacks had stopped, but whose prices had not dropped, and whose silence was louder than his threats had been. She thought about the letter from St. Paul, which had settled the tank's ownership, but not the war beneath it. She pressed harder and listened to the mud grip the wood and thought about what was rotting beneath the surface at Wicklow Tank that she could not yet see. Spring came to Wicklow Tank the way it comes to the northern plains, not as a season, but as a negotiation. The prairie offered a warm day and then took it back with a freezing night. It melted the top inch of snow and then sealed it under a crust of ice. It sent geese overhead, heading north, their calls carrying across the flat land like promises that might or might not be kept. By late March, the draws were running with snowmelt, and the mud was ankle-deep on every path, and the air smelled of thawing earth and wet grass, and the particular iron scent of a prairie that has been locked in ice for 4 months and is not yet sure it wants to let go. Moses Kettler was dying. He did not announce it. He did not complain. He continued to sit on his shelf in the warm chamber and teach Eli about wood grain and hoop tension and the difference between a joint that holds and a joint that merely touches. He ate the food Ragna brought and drank the tea she brewed and coughed into a cloth that he folded carefully so that the stains did not show. But Ragna saw. She saw the way he paused between sentences to gather breath. She saw the way his hands, which had once driven hoop wedges with a precision that made iron sing, now trembled when they held a draw knife. She saw the cloth. She did not say what she saw. She brought food and tea and sat beside him and listened while he talked, because talking was what he could still do, and what he talked about was everything he knew. He told her about brewery vats in St. Paul, how the Bavarian brewers sealed their fermentation vessels with pitch and beeswax, creating a surface so smooth that bacteria could not grip it. He told her about bridge carpentry on the Northern Pacific, how the engineers calculated load by measuring the deflection of a beam under weight, and how a beam that bent too far was already broken, even if it looked whole. He told her about grain elevators in Fargo, how the tall wooden bins channeled wind upward along their flat sides, and how the men who built them learned to round the corners after the first generation of square elevators cracked in winter gales. "Everything I have built," he said one morning in early April, while the sun came through the vent hole and made a disk of gold on the cedar floor, "has been round or curved or bowed. Flat things break. Round things give and hold. Your father knew that. The Bavarian knew that. The Romans who built arches knew that. It is the oldest engineering in the world, and every generation has to learn it again, because every generation starts by building boxes." Ragna said, "You are giving me your trade. I am giving you what I can carry in words. The tools go to Eli. She has the hands for it." He said this on the 5th of April. On the 7th, he did not get up from the shelf. On the 8th, his breathing changed, slower, shallower, with long pauses that made Ragna hold her own breath until his resumed. On the 9th of April, 1888, Moses Kettler died on the sleeping shelf he had helped build, in the warm chamber he had helped seal, with the vent he had insisted on still singing its thin note above him, and the temperature on the cracked thermometer reading 53 degrees. Ragna closed his eyes. She sat beside him for a long time. Eli sat on the other side, holding the tool bag that Moses had placed in her lap 3 days earlier and told her was hers now. Kittle and Marty were outside. Beret had taken them to her soddy when the breathing changed, and the warm chamber was quiet except for the vent and the sound of cedar settling in the spring warmth. There is a moment after a death when the world contracts to the size of the room you are in, and everything outside that room, the prairie, the sky, the future, the past, becomes theoretical, and the only thing that is real is the body beside you and the silence it has made. Ragna sat in that silence and felt the cedar walls around her and thought of nothing, and then thought of everything, and then thought of the thing Moses had said that mattered more than all the rest. A good barrel is not sealed shut. It holds what must live. She held what lived. She let go what did not. They buried Moses Kettler on the south side of the draw, where the ground had thawed enough to dig 4 feet, and Brackett drove a post into the earth and burned Moses's name into it with a rail spike heated in the depot stove. Ragna placed the 2 worn wooden wedges, the matched pair Moses had used on the first day, to show her how to drive a hoop, at the base of the post. They were smooth from 30 years of use, shaped to his hands, lighter than they looked. She went back to the tank and sat on the shelf where Moses had slept, and picked up the brace and Biddy had used to cut the vent, and held it for a long time, feeling the weight of it, the balance. Then she put it in the tool bag with the rest of his instruments, and closed the bag and set it on Eli's shelf. Eli was 10 years old. She had the hands for it. Moses had seen that. Ragna would make sure the hands learned what they were capable of. Lucius Pike's reckoning did not come from the direction he expected. Through the spring of 1888, Pike had continued his strategy of economic pressure. Prices elevated, credit tightened, availability controlled. He did not raise prices equally for everyone. He raised them for Ragna and for anyone who had publicly helped her. Beret paid 12 cents a yard for canvas, while a section worker's wife paid 8. Tulliff paid 6 cents a pound for nails, while Decker, who had stopped working for Pike after the storm and was now cutting fence posts independently, paid 3. The differential was small enough to be deniable and large enough to hurt. Ragna's barter network had blunted the worst of it: flour sacks for canvas, rawhide for ties, ash and clay for free. But food remained Pike's leverage. Flour, salt, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, the consumables that could not be salvaged or bartered, came through Pike's store or they did not come at all, and Pike set the terms. What Pike did not anticipate was that his strategy depended on isolation. It depended on Ragna being alone, without allies, without alternatives, without anyone willing to challenge the pricing structure that kept his store profitable and his power intact. The blizzard had changed that calculation. The blizzard had shown every family at Wicklow Tank that the woman Pike had tried to dispossess was the reason several of their neighbors were alive, and the man Pike had dismissed as a vagabond cooper was the reason the woman's method worked. Gratitude is not reliable currency in a frontier settlement. It fades with the next clear day, but respect for competence is harder to spend away, and Ragna had earned it in a denomination that Pike's ledger could not devalue. The break came in May, when a freight wagon from Valley City brought a new storekeeper's inventory to the siding. His name was Gerhard Tveit, a second-generation Norwegian from a family that had operated a general store in Moorhead, Minnesota, and had decided that the coming branch line made Wicklow Tank worth a risk. Tveit rented the old-school lean-to, now repaired, as a temporary storefront and posted prices that were not lower than Pike's old prices, but were lower than Pike's current ones, and the differential was not subtle. Pike could match the prices and lose the margin he had built through months of elevation, or he could hold his prices and lose the customers. He chose to hold because Pike believed that Tveit would fail, that one winter at Wicklow Tank would break a man from Moorhead the way it broke everyone who arrived with expectations built from a town with a rail junction and a proper depot. He was wrong. Tveit did not fail because Tveit's first act at Wicklow Tank was to visit the water tank and sit in the warm chamber and listen to Ragna explain how to make a building hold heat. He went back to the lean-to and spent 3 days building an inner partition, a raised sleeping platform, and a vent. And when the late spring cold snap hit in the second week of May, his store was the warmest building at the siding that did not have a stove, and his customers sat on his platform and drank coffee, and told him about the storm and the tank and the woman who counted leaks instead of walls. Pike saw the traffic shift. He saw the women carrying flour sacks from Tveit's lean-to instead of his store. He saw the men stopping at Tvate's counter for nails and rope. He did not say anything publicly. He adjusted his prices downward, point by point, until the gap closed. But the gap was not just price. The gap was trust, and trust, once broken by 40% markups during a blizzard winter, does not reset with a 20% correction in spring. By June, Pike's store was still operating, but his monopoly was over. The branch line had not yet arrived, but the competition had, and the competition had learned Ragna's method before Pike had been willing to admit it worked. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was the test of whether a method could outlive its inventor. Moses was gone. His tool bag sat on Eli's shelf. His brace and bit had cut vents in 7 structures at Wicklow Tank and 3 more at homesteads within walking distance. His matched wedges were at the base of a post on the south side of the draw. Everything he had taught lived in Ragna's hands, and Ragna's words, and the hands of the people Ragna had taught. And the question was whether those hands were enough. The answer came in November, when the first serious cold settled over the siding, and the families who had modified their shelters through the spring and summer took their first measurements. Tollef's grain bin, with its inner chamber and canvas partition and mud-packed base, 41 degrees at platform height when the outside temperature was 8 below. Not as warm as the tank because the bin's walls were thinner and rougher. But 41 was survivable. 41 was children sleeping instead of shivering. Decker's shanty, with a canvas inner room built inside the existing walls, a high vent cut through the roof, and a mud bank along the north-facing base, 38 degrees. Enough. His infant daughter, born the previous winter in a flooded room, now slept on a raised platform where the air was 5 degrees warmer than the floor, and her mother wrapped heated stones in cloth and placed them beneath the platform the way Ragna had shown her. And the child grew through the winter the way children are supposed to grow, slowly, steadily, without crisis. Even Hannah, the section worker's wife, whose shanty had lost its south wall, now had a repaired wall with a double canvas inner lining and a vent and a mud bank, and the candle flame inside burned straight, and the thermometer that Brackett had loaned, the same cracked thermometer with the same note still wired to it, read 36 at shelf height. Ragna walked the siding that November, visiting each modified structure, holding the candle, watching the flame. She did not celebrate. Celebration was not something she spent time on, but she marked what she saw, and what she saw was a siding where the candle flames burned straight in 12 rooms where they had once danced sideways, and where children slept on shelves above the cold instead of on floors where the cold pooled, and where vents sang their thin notes in the wind instead of rooms being sealed shut until the air went bad. It was in November of that second winter that Pike's store cellar cracked. The cold snap came fast, a drop from 12 above to 19 below in a single night, and the stone wall on the cellar's east side, which had been set dry without mortar, contracted at a different rate than the frozen ground it sat in, and a crack opened from the floor to the ceiling, and the cold poured in like water through a broken dam. Pike's flour, 200 pounds of it, his winter stock, froze and then absorbed moisture from the condensation, and by morning it was a solid block of ice and wheat that no one could eat and no one could sell. His lamp oil, stored in barrels along the east wall, thickened in the cold and then cracked the barrels when the oil expanded during a brief afternoon warming, and by the second morning his cellar floor was a frozen lake of kerosene and flour and shattered stoneware. Pike did not ask for help. Pike did not ask anyone for anything ever on principle, because asking was the first step toward owing, and owing was the first step toward losing. But his niece Clara Pike was living in the store loft that winter. She had come from Fargo after her father died of typhoid. And when the cold from the cracked cellar climbed through the floorboards and into the store and into the loft, Clara's situation became the same situation every family at Wicklow Tank had faced the previous January. A room that leaked, a building that gave its heat back faster than a stove could replace it. Clara came to the tank on the third night. She did not come to Rana. She came to Beret because Beret was less frightening, and Beret brought her to Ragna, and Ragna looked at Clara's chapped hands and chattering teeth and said, "How bad is the loft?" "The floor is ice. The stove cannot keep up. Uncle will not leave the store." Then we bring the store to him. Ragna went to Pike's store that night with Beret, Brackett, and 2 men she had trained, Tullough and Decker, who knew canvas and mud and vents because she had taught them. They walked into Pike's store, where Pike sat behind his counter with his coat on and his breath visible and his face arranged in the expression of a man who would rather freeze than admit he needed the woman he had spent a year trying to destroy. "Your cellar wall is cracked," Ragna said. "The cold is coming through the floor. You need an inner room." "I have a stove." "Your stove is fighting a crack that runs 8 feet. The stove will lose." She did not wait for permission. She and Tullough and Decker and Beret built an inner chamber in Pike's store in 3 hours. Canvas partitions hung from the ceiling beams, creating a room 12 feet square in the center of the store, away from the cracked east wall. Mud packed into the floorboard gaps where cold was seeping up. A vent cut through the west wall, not the roof, because the roof was sound, but the wall, because the west wall faced away from the wind and a vent there would draw without pulling in ice. They built a sleeping platform from Pike's own store shelves, dismantled and laid flat on crate legs, raised 2 feet off the floor. They moved Pike's stove inside the inner chamber, and the heat that had been fighting the whole store now only had to warm 12 square feet, and within an hour, the thermometer Clara had bought one from T-Vate's store, read 58 degrees at platform height. Pike stood in the inner chamber of his own store and looked at the canvas walls and the mud-packed floor and the vent that breathed and the stove that finally drew properly because it was no longer competing with an 8-foot crack in the cellar wall. He looked at Ragna. He looked at the men she had trained. He looked at Clara, who was sitting on the platform with her hands around a cup of coffee and her teeth no longer chattering. His conversion was not warm. It was not gracious. It was the conversion of a man who has been proven wrong in his own building by the person he tried most to break, and who knows that every person in the room is watching, and who must choose between silence and words, and knows that silence will be interpreted as stubbornness, and words will be interpreted as surrender. He chose words. "I called it railway trash," he said. Ragna looked at him. "You were half right. Trash is what people call a thing before they need it." Pike did not smile. Ragna did not expect him to, but he reached under his counter and took out a tin of lamp oil, the good oil, the oil he kept for himself, not the marked-up oil he sold to others, and set it on the counter and pushed it toward her. "For the vent lamp," he said, "the one in your barrel." It was the closest Lucius Pike would ever come to an apology. Ragna took the oil and left and did not look back, because looking back would have given him something he had not earned, the sight of her face showing that his word meant anything to her. It meant something. She would not let him see it. Thomas Cormack arrived at Wicklow Tank in the spring of 1889 on a wagon loaded with ashwood staves, iron tire rims, and a forge bellows that he had carried from a wheelwright's shop in Bismarck. He was 39, Scottish-born, widowed. His wife had died of scarlet fever in 1886, and he had the quiet, measured manner of a man who built things that needed to roll straight and bear weight without complaint. He was not looking for a wife. He was looking for a place where the branch line would bring enough wagon traffic to keep a wheelwright busy. Wicklow Tank had the promise of the branch line and the advantage of being cheap, and Cormack set up his forge in a shed near the depot and began repairing wagon bows and sleigh runners for the settlers, who were beginning to arrive in numbers now that the worst of the winter had passed and the rail company was advertising land again. He met Ragna because Ragna needed ash wood. She wanted to build curved windbreaks, half-circle frames of bent wood that could be set in the ground on the windward side of a building and banked with sod and snow, deflecting wind upward and over the structure instead of letting it hit the flat wall square. Moses had described the principle, "Guide the wind, do not fight it." But Moses had not had the wood or the tools to demonstrate. Cormack had both. Their first conversation was about the grain of ash wood. Ragna wanted the bows bent in a tight curve, and Cormack said ash would take the curve if steamed, but would crack if forced cold. She said she did not have a steaming box. He said he did. She said she could not pay for the use of it. He said he did not ask for payment. He asked for the right to watch what she built with the bows, because a wheelwright who understood how curved wood performed in wind would build better wheels. It was a trade, not charity. Ragnar accepted trades. He steamed the ash staves and helped her bend them into half-circle frames 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide. She set them in the ground north of the tank and banked them with sod and packed snow. When the wind came, it hit the curved frame and rose over it, and the dead air behind the frame was still enough to hold a candle flame steady at ground level. Cormac watched the candle burn straight behind the curved frame and said, "That is the same principle as a wheel fender. The fender curves the mud away from the axle. Your frame curves the wind away from the wall." "Everything curves," Ragnar said. "That is what I have learned. The tank curves, the hoops curve, the wind curves. If you build flat, you fight. If you build round, you guide." He looked at her for a long time after she said that. It was the look of a man who has found someone who thinks the way he thinks, but from a direction he had not considered. Their courtship, if the word applies to two people who spent more time discussing the tensile strength of ash wood than they did discussing anything personal, moved through the summer and fall of 1889. Cormac repaired wagon bows by day and built curved windbreak frames by evening. Ragnar taught families to seal their rooms and cut their vents and check their flames, and she came to Cormac's forge when the light was failing and drank coffee and said little and watched his hands on the iron and the wood. They married in October of 1889 in Beret's Soddy, with Brackett as witness and Eli holding Marte's hand and Kittle standing straight and not coughing. The ceremony was short. The meal afterward was long. Beret had baked flatbread, and Tollef had brought a smoked ham, and Tivate contributed a bottle of something he said was Norwegian but tasted Scottish, and Cormac said it tasted like home, and that was the last sentimental thing anyone said that evening. By 1892, Ragnar Assen Cormac operated a winter preparation yard beside the siding at Wicklow Tank. It was not a business in the way Pike's store was a business. It was a place where people came before their first winter and learned what they needed to know. The yard had a demonstration tank, the original fallen water tank, now sealed, doored, and maintained, with height marks scratched inside the cedar by every child who had slept on the shelf. It had a stack of canvas panels, pre-sewn by Ragnar and Beret and 3 other women who had learned the 4-inch overlap. It had a bin of ash clay grass mud mixture kept damp under canvas. It had a rack of curved windbreak frames built by Cormac and Eli, who was now 13 and could bend an ash bow in the steaming box without help. Ragnar showed new settlers the candle. She lit it in the demonstration tank and let them see the flame burn straight. She lit it in a drafty shanty and let them see it dance. She said, "The flame tells you what the wind is doing. Your job is to make the flame still. If the flame is still, the room is holding. If the flame moves, the room is leaking. Find the leak, seal the leak, check again." She did not charge for the teaching. She charged for materials, canvas at cost, mud mixture free, windbreak frames at the cost of the ash wood, vent covers at the cost of the tin. Cormac's forge provided the hardware. Brackett sent new settlers to her before their first winter with a note that said, "See Ragnar before you build." Beret kept the accounts in a ledger she had taken from Pike's store when Pike's store closed in 1891 after the branch line arrived and brought 2 competing merchants, and the monopoly that had sustained Pike's pricing evaporated in a single season. Pike left Wicklow Tank in the spring of 1891. He did not say goodbye. He loaded his remaining stock onto a freight wagon and headed west toward the Missouri, where towns were newer and monopolies were still possible. Clara stayed. She married Tollef's younger brother and moved into the grain bin homestead, which by then had proper walls and a proper roof, but still had the inner chamber and the vent, because Tollef's family had learned what Ragnar taught and saw no reason to unlearn it. Eli learned telegraphy from the depot operator and weather signals from the instruments at the new weather station, a tiny shack with a thermometer, a barometer, and a wind gauge, installed at the siding in 1890. She became the person who read the sky and the instruments and told Ragnar when to tell the settlers to seal their vents halfway and rotate their stones. She carried Moses's tool bag to every job and used his brace and bit to cut vents and structures from the siding to Valley City. The bit was worn smooth from use. She did not replace it. Kittle became a carpenter. He built proper houses for the families that arrived with the branch line, but every house he built had a high vent and a low intake, and no sharp corners on the windward side, because his mother had taught him what his lungs had confirmed, that air must move and walls must curve, and a room that cannot breathe is a room that kills. Marte became a teacher. She taught at the school that replaced the collapsed lean-to, and in her classroom there was a raised shelf along the north wall where children could sit above the cold floor during winter lessons, and behind the stove there was a vent the size of a fist with a sliding tin cover, and on the first day of every winter term she lit a candle and showed the children what a still flame meant and what a dancing flame meant, and the children thought it was a game, and it was also the most important thing she taught them. Within 3 winters of the blizzard of 1888, 27 families around Wicklow Tank used some version of Ragna's method. Not all of them had water tanks. Most did not. They had sheds, grain bins, root cellars, and shanties with too many leaks and not enough stove. But they had inner partitions and raised shelves and high vents and mud banks, and the candle flames in their rooms burned straight, and the children in their rooms slept warm, and the principle that Ragna had learned from her father and refined with Moses and proved in a blizzard was alive in walls she had never touched and rooms she had never entered. Ragna Asen Cormac lived out her remaining years at the siding that had cast her out on the morning after Christmas, 1887. She did not leave Wicklow Tank. She did not need to. The place that had been a water stop became a town, and the town grew around the woman who had taught it how to breathe. She kept the Cooper knife on the windowsill of the house Cormac built, a proper house with proper walls, but with curved windbreaks on the north side and a high vent in every room and no corner left unsealed. She died in 1921 at the age of 68 in a bed that sat on a raised platform 3 feet above the floor, with a window that faced south and a vent that sang when the wind came from the northwest. The last thing she built was a storm shelf for her granddaughter's bedroom. The last measurement she took was the temperature on the shelf, 54 degrees on a January morning when the air outside was 11 below. She wrote the number on the wall with a charcoal stub, the way she had written the first numbers on the cedar stave 33 years before. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, the temperature at Wicklow Tank dropped from 29 degrees above zero to 26 degrees below zero between noon and midnight, and the wind blew at 50 miles an hour across a prairie with nothing between the sky and the ground but snow. Amos Brackett had looked at a woman with 3 children and a dead man's receipt and said, "You need 4 walls, a roof, 6 cords, and a stove that draws." He was not wrong about what a family needed to survive. He was wrong about the shape it had to take. The answer was not 4 flat walls fighting the wind. The answer was a curve that let the wind pass, a room small enough to hold the warmth of the people inside it, a vent that let the room breathe, and a woman named Ragna Asen who stood in a broken water tank on the Dakota prairie and felt the wind stop and understood what her father had meant when he pressed his thumb to a barrel seam and said that air leaks are where winter enters. The tank still stands at what was once Wicklow Tank siding, cedar staves dark as iron, hoops rusted but holding, children's height marks scratched inside the curve. The wind still goes over it. It has never gone through.